Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a new guest for you, and this is Derrick Van Every. Derrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to come on and chat.
Same, I am really curious to have this conversation with you, which for the listeners, for you, dear listeners, I am going to introduce a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. Recently, I came across a paper that Derrick was the lead author on, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And this paper is titled Load Induced Human Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy Mechanisms, Myths, and Misconceptions. And I love talking about all of these three factors, so I delved into the paper and I decided to invite Derrick to talk about it on the show so that we can talk about what the findings of this paper were and how he interprets them, and also we can discuss practical applications of this research into your own training, dear listeners. But first, Derrick, when I have a new guest on, I always want my audience to get to know a little bit more about them if they're not already familiar with your work. So, my first question is, who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
Yeah, thanks. So I am a PhD candidate in the protein metabolism lab at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, um, with Dr. Stuart Phillips as my supervisor. Um, I previously, prior to that, I completed my master's degree in human performance at Lehman College in the Bronx with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Um, Before graduate school, loved weight training, always have. I've been doing it since I was in grade 9, so about 14 years old. And just, it is always something I just loved to do and read about and learn about. And in 2017, after finishing my undergraduate degree in human kinetics with a focus on movement science, I actually went to school to be like a high school gym teacher, middle school gym teacher, and realized that that wasn't for me. And I had the gym. My wife and I opened our gym, and that was something I did to have in our hometown. We live in a really small, one stoplight, small community here. Um, and Yeah, I was reading the literature for fun and in my own practice as a fitness coach and athlete myself, and wanted to take it a step further. So I'm, decided to uh, get obsessed with it and do a PhD in it. And so I do that, and I am a powerlifting and nutrition coach for Calgary Barbell as well. So kind of wear a lot of hats. So proud father of two children, James and Ella, and husband to Erica. So I think that's probably why I'm so awesome, is because of the family I have and the support I have from my wife, who encourages my crazy endeavors. So yeah, I'm happy to do what I do. I couldn't ask for a better life and job and career.
That is so special. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm really glad you have such a supportive family. And also, I really like to bring on guests like you, where you are a gym owner, you're a coach, you're also a researcher, or you are knowledgeable about research. It's great to have the convergence of all of these aspects, because not only do you understand how to read and conduct research, but you also know how to apply it. And I believe that that's really important to give people value, because if all you are is a practitioner but you don't really understand research and you can't apply it, well, you're limited in that way. And vice versa, if you can only understand and conduct research but you don't know how to translate it into real world application, you're also holding yourself back in the way that you can communicate with people and help them out. So I'm really excited to delve into this paper. And dear listeners, you will find a link to this paper in the show notes. It is completely free to read, which is a fantastic opportunity. And the first topic that I want to start with is the mechanisms part of the title and focus on the drivers or potential drivers of hypertrophy or muscle growth, if we want to use a more layman's term. And when I first learned of the concept of these potential driving mechanisms for hypertrophy, I learned that from Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, whom you studied under. And at the
Hmm.
time, he was proposing three mechanisms, potential mechanisms: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. So I'm wondering, Derek, if you can define each of these terms to begin.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So I think so yeah, first off, you know, none of this work, gets done, and we don't progress in the field without, work and models from folks like Dr. Schoenfeld who, proposed the three stimulus, if you will, or drivers of hypertrophy. Um, and so really, in its simplest terms, mechanical tension is the force experienced by the muscle fibers when we contract. So that can happen both in active contraction and passive tension. So that is essentially, you lift a weight and we're not really sure, somehow gets essentially sensed by the muscle, and um, basically gets transduced into like a biochemical state signal that we collectively term as mechanotransduction. And that leads to a cascade of anabolic signaling that, largely we think is responsible to a common nexus, or relatively attributable to mTOR, or the mechanistic or mammaline target of rapamycin complex 1. And that essentially is what we're mostly confident in driving muscle hypertrophy. Um, Metabolic stress, in short, um, metabolic stress is essentially the byproduct of contraction. So we have things that are essentially created after. So you have accumulation of things like lactate, hydrogen ions, and other metabolic stressors. Some calcium ion might be a consideration as well. And they were thought to stimulate anabolic signaling, but um, really the evidence doesn't support that. Um, and then, and yeah, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit further. And then in terms of muscle swelling, or the pump that we talk about, this is, kind of this, the transient cell swelling or in the muscle from the increased blood flow. Is when we contract our muscle, blood occludes and pools into the tissues. Um, and then, of course, you have the associations with swelling as a byproduct of contraction. And again, that's changes in the extra and intracellular water. And again, it's used interchangeably often with the pump. And I'm not sure if that's the correct way to do things, as the pump is more of a subjective experience. But again, we kind of talk about that as well in detail. And then in terms of muscle damage, yeah, we didn't talk about that in the review, but you know, in my opinion, I think um, the evidence is again um, not really there in terms of muscle damage. Again, it's more of a byproduct of contraction. So you have exercise muscle or exercise induced muscle damage, and that has been thought to initiate a cascade of responses. So things like um, inflammation, disturb like calcium regulation, and this activation of protein breakdown, if you will. And again, a lot of this is thought of things that are secreted from the muscle fibers when they experience damage. But yeah, there's really, things like repeated bout effect, and people get adapted to that stimulus, and then essentially when we have a person perform the same exercise, consistently, um, or the repeated bout effect, we don't really see that um, as a promoter of gains, in my opinion. Again, it may correlate with growth because it is a byproduct of mechanical tension, but it's certainly something that I don't recommend folks aiming in their programming. And yeah, like I said, not something you shouldn't seek out.
That makes sense. So the way it was, these mechanisms, potential mechanisms, were presented to me at the time was they seem to be the three of them: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage were almost equivalent. Whereas from what you're telling me now, it seems like we are pretty confident that mechanical tension is a driver of hypertrophy because it leads to mechanotransduction and that signaling cascade that seems to promote hypertrophy. But when it comes to muscle damage, in your view, the evidence isn't really there to state that it can be equivalent to mechanical tension. And in fact, you're saying potentially it's simply a byproduct of muscle contraction. And with metabolic stress, also, you're saying we did used to believe that it could be equivalent to mechanical tension, but now it doesn't seem to be the case. Is that an accurate representation of what you've said?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I think one of the things that gets challenging, right, when we say metabolic stress is not a driver of growth, everybody seems to get really worked up about this, and um, I think where the pump things like that aren't driving growth, as we kind of talk about in the review, but ultimately, um, there's a lot more at play with understanding mechanotransduction and the processes involved with uh, stimulating muscle growth. But there is a challenge, at least in experimentally, like discerning metabolic stress from mechanical tension in vivo, particularly, right? So again, because it's a byproduct of contraction, um, you know, so some people might think about this as like uh, a straw man, right? Because we can't prove that metabolic stress has no independent effect, and therefore it still could contribute. And now, in principle, I'd say I'd agree with that. That's true, but science doesn't really advance on theoretical permissibility alone, in my opinion. So we move forward on plausibility and predictive power, and so I guess the biggest thing, and we talk about this in the paper, is that if metabolic stress were a meaningful independent driver of hypertrophy, we should expect conditions where we have high metabolic stress, or as an additive, um, where there may be high metabolic stress where we have low mechanical tension, for example, um, inducing hypertrophy, or as an additive, like in the BFR literature, if we use, high load BFR, and then add BFR to, so sorry, high load BFR compared to traditional high load resistance training, we should see, because of the pooled metabolite accumulation, greater hypertrophy. But they don't. The evidence isn't there, to support metabolic stress. And so I think, the overall, um, my view on it is, some people will argue about the semantics of it and saying, well, it's so hard to prove that, isolate that variable. It's logistical challenging, in vivo, and certainly the case. But then, um, I guess like my thought behind it is, you know, that's that's exactly it. Consequently, um, it makes, I guess, from my lens as a researcher, I think there's really no role or a need to hypothesize a role of metabolic stress, because everything that stems from the hypothesis can actually just be explained by mechanical tension and the loading and the results of that and the fatigue associated with contraction. So sorry if that was long winded.
Not at all. It sounds like what you're saying is if metabolic stress was independently a driver of hypertrophy, so independently from mechanical tension, we would see an additive effect. So when you're doing mechanical tension oriented training that also includes an increase in metabolites, we would see that that's better than not having this metabolic stress. But that's not what the literature shows.
Yeah, precisely that. And I think, Stu always kind of will, we wrote about it in the review, like, think about conditions where we don't have a high degree of mechanical tension, but a high amount of metabolic stress. So things like 1,500-meter runners, right? Um, they're not promoting growth and things like that. Now, I will say, there's thousands of metabolites in human serum, so it's difficult to kind of rule out the plausibility of another um, or a role. But as an independent driver, and as far as the evidence suggests, an additive, I don't think it's there. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge, right, the metabolic stress that we experience from things like lower loads or BFR training, and as a consequence of contraction. I do think that assists in the recruitment of the higher threshold motor units as we fatigue throughout a set, right? And so that's why low load and high load, when you push close to muscular failure, um, stimulates similar gains in hypertrophy, and that's due to the ultimately um, muscle hypertrophy is fiber specific, and when those high threshold motor units at the fiber level are experiencing enough degree of mechanical tension and stimulus, that's going to lead to growth. But again, the metabolic stress per se is not anabolic in of itself.
That makes sense. And as you were talking, something occurred to me. You and I are discussing this, and we know what we're referring to, but it occurred to me that maybe for somebody in the audience, it's not immediately clear what kind of training can lead to metabolic stress specifically. So you've mentioned BFR. Could you clarify the principle behind this type of training is that generates metabolic stress?
Yeah, absolutely. So blood flow restriction training, or BFR, is essentially, or been referred to as katsu training, and essentially what it is, and I personally, I love it. It's a fantastic training methodology to and has a lot of utility. Like, I'm an old power lifter with some achy joints, so there's a lot of utility in it. And essentially what it is you occlude um, the musculature at the proximal level. So if things like the lower body, you use essentially a tourniquet, at the hip, for the quads, hamstrings, and then for the upper musculature, you can just around the delts, and use that for single joint things like biceps, triceps. So you can do multi joint. I'm not advising against it, but I personally just use it for single joint stuff. But the utility with blood flow restriction training is, it allows for lower loads, somewhere around 20%, even if of your 1RM, perhaps even lighter. Um, and what it does is essentially occludes the blood flow. So it lets the arteries deliver oxygenated blood to the tissues and perfuse the muscle, but it also restricts the veins from carrying out the deoxygenated blood. So you just get a pooling of metabolites built up in the musculature. And essentially, it's also, again, leads to a nice pump. But that drives fatigue. And so it's a nice joint friendly way. I like to think about it as a hurts so good because the occlusion does, and the metabolites do have some discomfort associated with it, of course. But when we compare that to traditional high load or even lower load resistance training, it seems to be as efficacious at promoting hypertrophy. And again, the thought is that comes from the fatigue setting in, leading to the recruitment of the higher threshold motor units and anabolic signaling from that process.
Yes, PFR is an excellent training method. It's painful, but in a good way, and yes, as effective as standard training for hypertrophy, which makes it excellent
Yeah,
when
and
somebody is
in
limited in the load they can use.
for sure in a rehab context, fantastic. I sometimes so I train in our lab right now and don't have access to uh, all the equipment that I would love to have, of course. So it I love it. I love BFR. I'm a big fan and proponent of it. I just again it's a tool in the toolbox and is nothing magic about it compared to traditional training. It's just another option.
Exactly. And it's not the only option to generate metabolic stress. And my understanding is that the unifying principle behind all of the training techniques that can generate metabolic stress is that we're trying to do a lot of repetitions with short rest intervals. So other techniques could be drop sets, myo reps, and rest pause sets. Basically, you're doing a lot of repetitions on a drop set. You're not resting at all. You're changing the weight on the stack and you're going again bunch of repetitions, you don't rest, you drop the weight on the stack again, and you go again. So these, because the muscle doesn't have, let's call it, time to rest, that leads to the accumulation and the creation of these metabolites.
Sure. And yeah, certainly I love all those methods as well. And that's why you see them to be an effective strategy for training. Particularly those that are limited with, time. Like I personally use mile reps all the time as an effective way for, I got two kids, so I get up really early to train and try to get home by the time they wake up. So I leverage mile reps quite a bit in my training. But again, that if we get down to like the nitty gritty of like the mechanisms for why we see equivalent hypertrophy, right? If you think about the utility of lower loads and BFR, if you will, and um, not using as much as what we call higher threshold motor units, right? That are those powerful muscle type 2 muscle fibers that generate a lot of force and fatigue very fast, right? So with a heavy load, they're recruited early in a set because they're needed to meet the force demands required by the musculature. With lower loads, BFR, things like that, we have more of what's called motor unit recycling. And so because you think about what's called Henneman's size principle, where you kind of bypass the lower threshold motor units or the smaller fibers, type 1 fibers, and get to the type 2s. Those type 2s aren't needed for lower loads, but as fatigue sets in and we start to not be able to recruit and regenerate the recycling of the motor units, that's when we start to tap into these type 2 motor units. And so what happens is essentially at the fiber level, when you push to failure, or we'll call it muscular task failure, right? So if you think about it as a task failure, doing a set of bicep curls, you can't get that rep. Now, that doesn't mean all your muscle fibers aren't able to contract. It's just you're not able to meet the force demands required. And that's what happens when you take 5 or 6 deep breaths, you put the weight down, or you take a plate off or whatever, and now you're able to complete the task again. And so, inevitably, what's happening is you're just getting, the fibers to fatigue.
And a concept that was actually quite important for me to learn. At least I thought I had a mind blowing moment when I understood that was that's what makes a high degree of motor unit recruitment important. It's the fact that hypertrophy occurs, mechanical tension is sensed at the fiber level. So each fiber needs to sense tension and it needs to sense enough of it to start mechanotransduction and then start the signaling cascade that results in hypertrophy. So the higher your motor unit recruitment, the more fibers you are utilizing. So the more fibers are sensing that tension, the more of them are likely to sense enough of tension, ideally, that we can then stimulate hypertrophy in each individual fiber. So if you were to recruit fewer fibers, you would have fewer fibers that could grow.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's important for things like regional hypertrophy, and we're starting to see you know changes in growth in within a muscle, uh based off whether it's proximal or distal and lengthen and shorten bias. And that might get into the weeds a little bit there, but that you'll see some growth in different areas uh within the same muscle if the exercises change to again stimulate fibers in a particular range.
Fun fact, Derek, I actually interviewed Dorian Varovich on this just recently. So
Oh,
his
oh,
episode is going
nice.
to come out 2 weeks before yours.
Okay, great. Well, I'm looking forward to listening. Yeah, Dorian's an awesome guy. We've had a few interactions over Instagram, and I think he does a great job as a fellow scientist, kind of putting out some good content for the general audience to learn and appreciate uh, the field a little bit more. And I think for fellow scientists as well, he does a great job of communicating. So yeah, really looking forward to you know listening. And yeah, I hope he talks a little bit more about his isometric length
Absolutely.
research that just came out. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a good paper. It's a good paper.
I agree. I found it really interesting. And we talked all about regional hypertrophy and isometrics. I thought it was super interesting. But going back to our conversation, so then if we tie a bow on this particular topic, then the practical application I see from this is we don't need to aim to design a training program to chase metabolic stress. It's a tool that we can use for hypertrophy, but what we want to focus on is to train in a way that promotes enough mechanical tension to be sensed by each muscle fiber to then lead to mechanotransduction and then the signaling cascade we've talked about.
Yeah, exactly. I think the importance here is that hypertrophy is such a forgiving adaptation and can be achieved across a wide range of loading paradigms. And that can happen, and we see this kind of, range, if you will, that we've kind of talked about in a loading recommendations with Dr. Schoenfeld and Daniel Plock and Joseph Gurgic back in 2021. But you know, it can be somewhere as low as 4 upwards to 30 repetitions as like promoting equivalent hypertrophy. I like to think as that sweet spot is like the 6 to 12. I went as low as 4 because I'm a power lifter and I love lifting heavy, but that doesn't mean you have to, right? I coach powerlifters who think anything above 5 is, quote unquote cardio. But what happens is it's the discomfort from the byproduct and the metabolic stress and the lactate, inorganic phosphate, etc. That is creating discomfort, and it's not fun. But at the same time, you have utility in the lower loads that, hey, my knees are hurting, my elbows are hurting from this heavy lifting. Why don't I do some higher rep work and get a decent stimulus to promote growth and continue to make gains while not dealing with the joint stress, right? So there's one end of the spectrum, low repetition, heavy weight, let's move it. You're going to get a ton of tension, you're going to get a ton of stimulus, but there's going to be a lot of joint stress, injury risk for some, right, if you will. And then on the higher end, it's like there's some utility in lower loads, but yeah, there's you got to push close to failure. It's discomforting. You're going to have some, you might feel nauseous, etc. And then again, the sweet spot is always somewhere in the middle, in my opinion, somewhere around that like 6 to 12 to 15 reps is like being heavy enough, stimulative enough, and able to tolerate a lot of the byproducts. And again, I think sorry if this is long winded, but what it comes down to ultimately is many roads lead to Rome, and uh, push hard, close to failure, and pick your exercise that you enjoy, and that's ultimately what's going to drive your gains is the consistent hard training over and over and over again.
No need to apologize for being long-winded. For one, if somebody didn't like that, they wouldn't be listening to this podcast. They would just be on Instagram watching reels. Number two, I invited you here. You're the guest, so I want to hear you talk as much as you
Okay.
want.
All right.
Aside from that, I am wondering about your take on what I'm about to say, Derek, because a question that somebody in the audience right now might have is, okay, you're saying that we need to focus on mechanical tension. So what does that mean in practical terms? And Derek, the way that I conceptualize it is from a perspective of mechanical tension, I'm thinking about we want to use the right form to engage the specific muscle that you want to train, and we also want to take that muscle close enough to task failure by leaving either no reps in the tank or at most two, maybe three reps in the tank for most exercises. And this is how we can generate that mechanical tension. And then I'm also marrying that concept to the concept of what we know about the relationship between volume and hypertrophy, to where once I've established that at the per set level, we have that intensity of effort, relative intensity of effort, and that form in place, at the microcycle or macrocycle level, we are also placing enough volume towards the target muscle, enough that we can see progressive overload over time, and that we have enough time to complete as well, because that's an important component of it, and also enough that we can recover. And a lack of recovery to me would be we're not seeing that progressive overload over time, and in the worst case scenario, we would be seeing a regression. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that take.
Yeah, no, that's pretty spot on. I mean, I like the proximity to failure, particularly if your goals are hypertrophy. We want to get closer. To it seems like Martin Ruffalo in Australia has done some good work with trained folks, comparing proximity to failure, and it seems about 2 reps is equivalent. Pushing to failure may quote unquote generate more fatigue, and it may not be warranted. But again, I think that's warrants more investigation, in my opinion, because I do think there's something to be said about pushing to task failure when the goal is hypertrophy uh, for a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest thing is just like really, really knowing where you're at, and it's not to say I've been doing this for 17 years. I leave repetitions in the tank most of my training. One, two, three, or four, depending on the exercise. But sometimes you gotta go there, and you gotta how do you know where the line is if you're not willing to cross it every once in a while? It's kind of like my philosophy, and that doesn't mean like every day, but it does mean picking your spots and kind of audit yourself, or um, and I think that's an important factor in tracking progression and performance. But yeah, I think overall it's a pretty good take.
Thank you. And I agree with your take on the one of the potential applications of training to failure. I strongly believe that if you've never taken a set to failure, even if the research shows that it might not be necessary, if you don't know, as you say, where the line is, how do you know that you are leaving 2 reps in reserve? If you've never known what it's like to have no reps in reserve.
For sure, and that's the thing we do with our training studies. We one of the caveats with our research is that we push our participants to what's called volitional failure, and so what that means is they stop when they don't think they can get another rep. But there's also a kind of a phenomenon of the lab effect, and so there's myself and a team of researchers and graduate students, and we're pushing people, and we're getting them to push as hard as they can. They think they got another one, and we push them till they essentially can't. Particularly in the screenings and when we enroll participants, we tell them the first couple weeks we're going to push you. We want you to try and learn the concentric failure, and that's so you get acclimated. And we do. I should follow up. We do training studies with both trained and untrained folks, but for the purpose of this, we'll talk about both folks. push to failure so that you really know where you're at. And it's a skill in of itself to learn how to, fail a repetition. And we're there, of course, to spot and to keep them safe. But yeah, that is an important factor in our training to really give people, hey, that you'd be surprised what you're capable of when you really lock in and push yourself. And so, um, yeah, I think again, just an important factor, like we mentioned, is knowing that you probably got more than you think.
Absolutely. And another application that you actually implied but didn't necessarily spell it out, so I'm gonna do it now, is you mentioned if you're training with low loads and doing high repetitions, I think if I'm quoting you correctly, you said something like you gotta go to failure. And that is another application of failure training that in my opinion is valuable. If you are choosing to do above, I usually think of it as above 15 repetitions. Some research has shown that our ability to gauge RPE is less accurate, but also it seems that there's an independent effect of the load. When the load is perhaps on the lighter side, so 15 plus, it seems like it is better to push to task failure in order to generate a similar amount of hypertrophy as if you were using heavier loads and lower repetitions. So that's the other application that I usually think when there's an isolation exercise typically, so it's very safe and the learning curve isn't particularly steep. I typically recommend clients to, and we're planning for 15 plus reps. I typically recommend my clients to take it to failure.
Yeah, then that's a really good approach. And yeah, like we mentioned, the lower loads, it's again, it because the higher threshold motor units aren't being recruited at the onset of a set. It's important to push uh, to fair or at least very close. In my humble opinion, you got to get um, and again, that's one of the limitations of the lower load is, sometimes people aren't able to get there. They kind of reach, the pain, right? The pain tolerance, or their maximal tolerable perception of effort, if you will, something like that, where it's just like the pain is too much. So maybe I just add a little bit of weight and drop the reps, right? Um, but again, just kind of dependent on the individual and their ability to tolerate that discomfort.
Absolutely. And I think an important takeaway from this is that even when research shows that perhaps something isn't necessary, it doesn't mean that we have to throw it out. For example, you mentioned there's that Refalo research. I actually interviewed him on that exact paper back when it came out. And we
Nice,
talked about
nice.
how
Yeah, another
it
great
seemed
paper.
like, yeah, see, I'm good with this podcast. I try hard to get people who are on the cutting edge of research. Anyway, jokes aside, we did talk about how it seems like potentially getting close enough to failure in some cases might be equivalent to training to failure. But for all the reasons we've just stated, failure training has its own uses. So it doesn't mean that now we don't use it anymore. It just means that we apply it in different contexts and we don't feel beholden to having to go to failure for our program to be effective.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. And
All
one
right.
of the
So
things with
go
the
ahead.
research. Oh, so I was just gonna say, like, one of the things with the research, and this is important, and yeah, I'm sure if you've had other researchers on, I would imagine they'd be echoing this sentiment or have shared it before, is that research does not tell you what to do, right? It illustrates concepts, and we test concepts and hypotheses, and we generate, group averages and say, hey, we tested XYZ intervention on this, and this is what we found at a group level. We've had, I'm doing a higher versus lower load study right now in females, which is exciting. But preliminary data, we've had a couple that have, in one condition lost some lean muscle mass, and the other they've gained. And so, uh, or in the same condition, we've had a participant gain and others have lost. And so there's an individual aspect as well, right? But in the group level, everybody seems to be making progress. But if we, for whatever reason, to XYZ, we we didn't see growth or whatever. And so that's an important factor as well. On the average, we see this, but at the individual level, hey, this may not be an effective strategy for you, right? And so, again, illustrating that research just provides kind of a starting point, a framework to build off of, but ultimately individualizing your training for your clients, yourself, all that good stuff is going to be the best way of going.
Absolutely. Excellent corollary. So, on that note, I am very happy with these three potential drivers of hypertrophy we've discussed. The next potential mechanism that you brought up is cell swelling and or the pump. And you already implied when you first mentioned it that it might not be the exact same thing. So, tell us what the difference exactly is between the pump and cell swelling.
Yeah. So the pump again. Sorry if I kind of glossed over it, but essentially the pump is this acute or transient swelling, um, intra and extracellular, of the increased blood flow, right? So when we lift and we weight train and have contraction again, so similar idea of BFR, whether or not you have the tourniquet applied or not. When we contract, our muscles occlude, right, and that's to deliver, the arteries so they can deliver oxygenated blood to the musculature. And the veins, of course, will compress, reducing blood flow away. So when we use BFR as an additive, it's to hold the blood from leaving, but again, as an additive factor. But again, veins compress, hold the blood in, reducing things away. Arteries carry blood into the muscle, and so we get this transient swelling. And essentially, what it is, it's more plasma into the interstitial fluid of the muscle. So it's not actually in the muscle fibers directly per se, right? And so it's in the cell. And so what happens, we see swelling upwards of 48, even 72 hours from a hard high workout, if you will. And so that's why we, as researchers, we need to account for that when we do our body composition measurements. And we usually have folks abstain from, hard, vigorous activity or training for at least 48, upwards of 72 to even 96 hours before testing. And so, again, it's just that those alteration change in the plasma. And so I like I don't want to get touted as this guy that hates the pump. Like I absolutely love it, right? So that's the first thing I'll say. Um, it's it looks great. It's motivating for a lot of people. Like I own a gym. I trained this morning at 4:30 in the morning. I left at about 6. There's a guy in there flexing, in the mirror. So that can also be like a motivating thing. And again, it feels awesome. I flex in the mirror, right? But again, it's not a hypertrophic mechanism. I think that's important to full stop, right? And again, I think while the pump and cell swelling are used interchangeably, I reckon that they shouldn't be, and I'll kind of explain why. And so the the pump is a subjective perception of that cellular swelling, right? And so, um, it's how you perceive how the bicep is feeling during a cable curl, for example, right? So maybe you think you have more swelling or a better pump, quote unquote, from a cable curl versus a preacher curl, but in reality, um, there's no difference or very minuscule. And that's because like humans, like we're not ultrasounds, right? We're not able to detect those fluid shifts. And no studies directly investigated that. And again, conceptually constraints, I really think that would be difficult to do. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. Um, so the thought may be that this increased pressure within the cell, leading to like the cellular membrane sensing it, may be thought as like a uh, survival mechanism sort of thing or a threat, and it initiates a cascade of signaling to promote growth adaptations. Um, yeah, no evidence on that. Some have thought it may promote increases in satellite cell activity and, of course, myonuclei associated with those satellite content. But again, no evidence on that. Um, and again, I'm happy to change my tune if somebody can show that, because in our review we refer out to some other great reviews on some of the other factors involved in hypertrophy, like satellite cells, and I don't want to get into that, but that ribosome biogenesis and all these other factors. Mike Roberts from Auburn has, in my opinion, like the definitive review on mechanical overload and its adaptations. And of course, our lab with Dr. Chang Lim has a great review as well, and of course, Dr. Schoenfeld's updated his with Henning Walkeraj. And so there's some really great reviews out there, which I'm sure I'll get you the link in the show notes. The current evidence. So there's really like two studies that are really looking at like acute swelling, predicting some variance in short-term hypertrophy. So first thing, full stop, as many of your listeners will know, correlation not uh, equivalent to causation, right? So just because something has more swelling doesn't mean it's indicative of promoting growth. But essentially, if you think about it this way, protocols that are inducing a huge pump versus normal training. So again, we talk about the BFR literature, the lower loads, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to get probably a more swelling from that, and we don't see greater hypertrophy. The only in vivo study that's published to this date is a study from 2022. Hirono and colleagues, I want to say Hirono, and essentially they did leg extensions for 6 weeks. And what they did was they measured the swelling at multiple sites. I think it was like 9 sites, and they did the swelling from leg extensions. And essentially, what they did was they measured all the participants and then said, "Okay, go train for 6 weeks, come back, and we're going to measure the cell swelling again via ultrasound." And again, I want to just reiterate, humans, yourself, you are not an ultrasound. This is a subjective experience as the pump. And so that has no correlation between, the perception and acute swelling. But this was a good, I guess, way to interrogate the correlation. And so what they found was those that had greater swelling or cell swelling, that was associated with, and that was at the start of the study, sorry. So those had the greater pump, if you will, following 6 weeks. They did seem to have greater hypertrophy, and that was, again, correlational. And then when you factor in the R squared value, essentially, what that means is about 25% of the variance in the results was explained due to the cell swelling. So what that doesn't tell us, right, is, that's just cell swelling in general. What it's not telling us is if the pump from a leg extension versus the hack squat or something would infer greater hypertrophy, right? So somebody may perceive that they get a better pump on leg extensions, but if you push a hack squat and they're both to or close to failure, probably won't see any difference. And then the other one that we talked about in our review was it was like a conference abstract from Oda and colleagues, and they did like ridiculous, like 100 repetition sets of like the peroneus brevis and longus muscles, which are essentially like plantar flexors, so like calf musculature. And yeah, you can't really scrutinize anything because it's very hard to find. But I, again, take that with a grain of salt. All of that collectively, again, enjoy the pump. It's great for most people. Like, most people enjoy the pump. It's great for adherence, and that's ultimately going to be the most important thing with your training, right? Is showing up and doing the work. But let's not mistake this as the sensation as a stimulus, right? So I think that's the ultimate goal of the papers to say, hey, pumps it's awesome, but it's not a stimulus for growth. And so just because you may perceive a greater pump on an exercise doesn't mean it's better um, than another.
And following on from that, that also doesn't mean that you want to design a training program with the intent of generating a pump and vice versa feel like a program isn't effective because you're not getting a pump. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So, if you enjoy a hack squat over, high bar squat or whatever, that's fine. But if you're going to choose you know, let's say a sissy squat versus a leg extension, I'm just spitballing exercises here because you feel a better uh, pump that doesn't, you know, infer that you're going to get greater growth. And I think the most important thing with program design, again, pick what you're going to adhere to and be able to train hard and consistently show up again and again. And so, um, exercise selection is going to be secondary to and if, you um, prioritize that over a pump. But again, what we're trying to reiterate is uh, we just want to get more people lifted.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Derek, in your own practice as a coach, do you use the pump at all as data to inform your coaching decisions in some way?
No, I personally don't. And so again, I primarily coach powerlifters, and so I will say, um, in my experience, now this might be a hot take, but I think powerlifting training and strength focused and managing fatigue is a little bit more constrained and challenging than hypertrophy. And again, that's just one's take of somebody who's in kind of in both camps uh, and has done both, right? So I think I at least get a little bit of credence to share that opinion. Um, Now, with that said, the athletes that I do work with and personal training clients in the past, etc., um, I I think it's important just to again focus on the big rocks. Okay, so we track, um, with our athletes things like overall, excitement to train, motivation, mood, soreness, joints, things like that. Sleep, of course, is an important proxy that we use to measure like fatigue. But those are just individual decisions that I'll make with athletes. And so sometimes I'll use exercises, single joint stuff, just say, go in, pick what you like and do it. Biceps of choice, triceps of choice, etc. For the power lifters, it's just because I want them to get a stimulus, get blood moving, and because it feels good. And so I won't use a pump per se as like a way to augment decisions, but I will give athletes the autonomy to make those decisions that it's going to allow them to go into the gym and train hard and get a stimulus, if that makes sense. Um, I'm not hating on like I was a student of Dr. Mike Israetel in New York and his model of like using um, pumps as a one of the models for their programming, and I'm certainly not opposed to it, but it's not one that I personally um, factor in.
Well, that makes sense. Thanks for explaining. I also think that it's quite common for the people that I work with to get concerned if they don't feel a pump, just because it is such a popular concept and everybody talks about it. I've had more than one client tell me, so many people on social media will say, "Oh, I do this chest workout or this individual exercise and I get a massive pump." And some clients will tell me, I don't really get that. Is that a concern? And we've talked about how it doesn't seem to be, but also I think that social media doesn't tell the whole story in that different. I found that the pump can be perceived under specific conditions. Not all conditions because the exercise is in quotation marks effective. So Derek, I'm gonna list the
For sure.
conditions that I found in my experience, and I'd like to hear your experience in return. I've noticed that the pump is a lot more noticeable when we are isolating a muscle as opposed to doing a compound lift. When we're doing a decent number of repetitions, usually at least 10, on less than 10 rep sets, the pump is not as obvious typically. I've also noticed that it's more obvious when we're training at shorter muscle lengths. So, for example, a compound lift that's hardest in the lengthened position, this could be a Romanian deadlift or a hack squat. Those do not generate a massive pump in the moment like a bicep curl might do. I've also developed my own theories about um, what could cause somebody's perception of the pump to increase. And one of the theories that I have is I've noticed that people have a who have a better mind muscle connection with a certain muscle typically report a pump in that muscle. Whereas when there's a muscle that is, and not only a better mind muscle connection, although there's usually a correlation between the two, but also that muscle is especially well developed. So the bigger the muscle is, I've noticed, the more likely the person is to mention that they feel a pump, and also the better the mind muscle connection with it is. And sometimes, as I've said, the two are go hand in hand. Whereas when the muscle is either less developed or the mind muscle connection isn't as strong, or the two also occur together, somebody is less likely to perceive a pump. I'm wondering if you agree or disagree, and if you've noticed anything else in yourself.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty good take. I would agree with all of that essentially. The mind to muscle connection stuff I think is important. So if I may, the Dr. Schoenfeld did a study where they did like the whole like mind to muscle technique where they had people focus on bicep curls and squats, and one of them was like, okay, get the weight up or focus on squeezing the muscle. And what they found in the biceps was it seemed that the focusing on the squeeze led to a little bit greater growth. Compared, they didn't see that in the lower body musculature, and I think um, the impetus for that would probably be due to the twofold, right? So you have compound movement like a squat needing more uh, coordination and shifting of load demands throughout. So the compound lift, obviously, squats are going to train your quads, but also the posterior chain, hip extensors, etc. Um, so the idea of like the perception, at least again, this is where it comes down to you're not an ultrasound, right? You may not experience the pump per se in larger compound multi-joint movements. And again, I think that's what, but they, again, you don't see differences in growth. With the larger the muscle, again, I think that's due to the occlusion effect. More muscle you have, larger occlusion, right? And so you have more blood pooling into those tissues. And so that's also probably a factor. You know, um, the other thing I think is important, and sorry that I kind of skipped this, the factors leading into the perception of a pump that can be drastically influenced by one's hydration status, what their sodium intake is like, right? Like there's a reason, like I've competed in bodybuilding last year. I used to take, a tablespoon of salt before going on stage, 15, 20 minutes. That's not, that's not promoting growth. That's literally to tighten up and get the blood pressure up and look fuller right on stage. That's not a growth stimulus. So again, hydration status, sodium levels. You could argue, the dietary supplements, things like nitrate, citrulline malate, things that are going to promote nitric oxide production, and so that's a whole other can of worms that we could talk about, but it's great. But again, it's not significantly promoting growth.
Yeah, I think what's important here is that there are a lot of factors that can increase your perception of the pump, as you're saying, Derek, that don't lead to hypertrophy. And the perception of the pump itself doesn't seem to lead to hypertrophy. So I think it's valuable for listeners like my clients who worry to know that whether they have that sensation or whether they don't, if they are executing the lift in a biomechanically effective way, which sounds fancy, but I'm going to explain that it's actually quite simple. There is no way you are not engaging a certain muscle. And what I mean by biomechanically effective is in order to push forwards, you need to engage your pecs. So if you are executing a bench press in even not in a perfect way, but in the most basic of ways, your pecs need to be doing at least some work, whether you then perceive a sensation in that muscle or whether you don't. And actually, this brings up another reason that could decrease the perception of a pump. I've noticed that beginners be, potentially because of a lesser mind muscle connection and just lesser experience with it, they seem to report a pump less often than people who are more trained. People who are more trained seem to be better able to recognize it. I don't know what the exact reason may be. I assume it's lack of experience, knowing what that even is and how to train in an effective way. But if you're a beginner, that's another reason why you might not perceive as much of a pump. So, anyway, the main point that I was trying to make was that I have come to, in recent years, I've come to think of sensation, so the client's perception of training as valuable but secondary to the execution of the lift. When the execution of the lift looks the way it should, and the and when I say execution, I am also encompassing intensity of effort within that term. So I'm looking at a client's video that they sent to me about their exercise footage, basically, and I want to see the form that's supposed to engage the muscles we're trying to train, and I'm also trying to see if they are pushing close enough to failure. And those two elements to me are more important than the perception, but I also do ask them what their perception of the exercise is to inform any small tweaks that we might make to the execution. What do you think of that, Derek?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great approach and solid strategy.
Awesome. All right. So we've covered the pump. I think we're busting a few myths and maybe making some people cry because back in the day, there were entire training programs just devoted to generating the most amount, the biggest pump possible.
Yeah, I mean, look,
But
again, I love it myself. So it's again, we talk. Um, the science doesn't support it, and ultimately, as Lay Norton would say, the data doesn't care about your feelings, and that includes me. Like, you know, so yeah,
yeah, definitely. Actually, you might find this interesting because I like to overthink all of this stuff because I'm quite brainy. But I also have a theory that there might be a sex-based difference when it comes to the pump, in that I've noticed that my clients who are females or were assigned female at birth, so their biological sex is female, they tend to struggle to perceive a pump more so than people who are males or assigned male at birth. And over the years, I've always taken an interest in sex-based research or the
sure,
differences between sexes when it comes to training. And I've come across a lot of theories. So one of them being that females start with a lower baseline muscle mass than males. So even though they can achieve the same amount of growth in percentage, so in relative terms, they achieve a lower amount of growth in absolute terms because they start with less muscle. So then that makes me think, oh, maybe they struggle with the pump because the muscles are smaller to begin with. And we were talking about how bigger muscles can help with that perception. And then some theories that I've not seen much evidence or research on have also been related to potentially females having easier blood flow to the muscle because there is less occlusion. So they might experience better muscular endurance. And so as a result of that, it's more of a struggle for them to perceive that pump. And so these are the theories that I thought about. I'm not going
Yeah,
anywhere with
no, that's
this. I'm
great.
just sharing the
No,
thoughts I've had
I
in my head.
yeah, I mean, so my PhD is specifically on female muscle physiology, and so um, yeah, really great take. So you mentioned the relative differences in muscle growth, exactly. Um, what explains this lack of perception of pump exactly? On average, right, women have lower absolute muscle mass, and so you have less occlusion, right? So you don't have this pooling of metabolites in blood. The other thing is, women seem to have more capillary density in the muscle itself, meaning they have more uh, blood flow perfusing the musculature. So metabolites are clearing out. There's less occlusion, and so that's the thought of like, there may be some more utility for females with lower load training because of that. Stay tuned. We're doing that site right now, but again, I think we won't see a difference provided that everybody pushes to failure. It may be that some females may tolerate the discomfort better than males. That's just my um, based off what we just talked about. That's kind of my sense with that literature. Um, and then, yeah, I think um, just to reiterate, like if the pump is a factor and females aren't getting a pump now, I'm not. This isn't really, this is more philosophical and not grounded in any hard literature, of course. So, but if females aren't perceiving a pump, but we're getting equivalent relative growth and hypertrophy, again, there it is, right? So I'll leave it. I'll leave it with somebody else to tell me why.
I'll have to bring you back on when that study comes out about low
Absolutely.
load versus higher loads. In any case, yes, your point is exactly what I was trying to get at. It would be nice for everybody to perceive um, the pump or the effects of training and think, wow, this is the most effective workout ever, because it helps with motivation from a psychological perspective would be really nice. But ultimately, what's very helpful about research is that it can show us that in this particular case, whether you get a pump or whether you don't, whether you're a female or whether you're a male, you seem to be putting on muscle at the same relative percentage, or rather, you seem to be putting on muscle at the same relative speed. So it doesn't matter if you have that reassurance or if you don't. It would be nice emotionally, but science doesn't care about your emotions and nor do your muscles, unfortunately.
Yeah, 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 for sure. I agree.